The saddest deaths left no bodies, only empty records. The Forgotten Orphan Train. Before the trains existed, before newspapers learned how to dress cruelty as charity, there was a silence that lived in the cracks of American cities. A silence that smelled of damp stone, cold iron, and forgotten breath. Children lived inside that silence. Not hidden, not invisible, just ignored. They slept where buildings met the ground, where staircases ended in darkness, where warmth was something you borrowed from another body for a few hours and then lost again. These children were not born unwanted. Most of them were loved first, held first, named with hope. Then disease arrived without knocking. Cholera emptied homes in days. Tuberculosis stretched death slowly, painfully. Influenza erased entire families before neighbors learned their names. A child would wake beside a parent who no longer breathed, shake a shoulder that never moved again, and step into a world that had already moved on. Factories swallowed fathers and returned none. Machines took hands, lungs, lives, and the city called it progress. Mothers worked until their bodies failed, washing other people's clothes while their own children waited hungry. Rent notices came, doors closed, and when no door opened again, the streets became teachers. Hunger taught faster than school ever could. Children learned which faces looked away, which boots kicked, which shopkeepers threw scraps after closing. Society gave them new names: street rats, burdens, problems, never sons, never daughters, never children. Cities grew rich beside them. New York glittered within walking distance of boys who slept under docks. Boston prayed inside. Churches built beside alleys full of girls who had learned to stay silent. Philadelphia punished hunger by arresting it, filling jails with children whose crime was existing without permission. Charities overflowed. Sympathy thinned. People asked a dangerous question. Not how do we save them, but what do we do with them? How do we move them somewhere else so we don't have to see them anymore? That question felt practical. It felt clean. It felt merciful to those who would never sit on cold stone waiting for morning. An idea was born that sounded like kindness when spoken aloud. Send the children away, out of the cities, into fresh air, onto farms, into homes that needed help. Men stood on platforms and spoke about opportunity, discipline, new beginnings. Newspapers praised the vision. Donations flowed. Parents who were still alive were told their children would be cared for. Educated returned when life improved. The word temporary was used often. Children were told they were going on a trip. No one explained that trips can become erasures. Preparation happened quietly. Names were written down quickly, often wrong. Ages were guessed. Papers were thin. Promises were thick. Children packed nothing because they owned nothing. Some carried memories folded inside themselves. Some carried fear. Some carried hope because children always try to believe adults. On a cold morning, a train waited without ceremony. No music, no prayers, just steel and smoke. Children lined up. Some still searched the crowd for familiar faces. Some already understood that this line was a border they would never cross back over. The whistle cut through the air, sharp and final, and as the train began to move, childhood did not end loudly. It faded, quietly, permanently. They called it a solution because solutions sound clean when spoken from warm rooms. In crowded halls filled with polished shoes and folded hands, men discussed children as numbers that needed moving, not saving, moving. Cities were choking on poverty and progress at the same time, and the smallest bodies carried the heaviest blame. Newspapers printed words like reform and rescue, words that made readers feel kind without requiring them to look too closely. Charity leaders stood before microphones. and promised futures they would never have to deliver personally. The language mattered. They avoided the word separation. They preferred opportunity. They avoided the word loss. They preferred placement. They avoided the word goodbye entirely. Behind those speeches were letters never meant for public eyes. Letters that spoke of efficiency and supply and demand. Farms needed hands. Towns needed labor that didn't complain. Children were small enough to be shaped, quiet enough to be controlled, cheap enough to be justified as help. Mercy became a wrapper, and inside it sat necessity dressed as kindness. Parents who still breathed were told stories designed to calm panic. Your child will eat. Your child will learn. Your child will come back. Temporary was repeated until it sounded like truth. Some parents signed papers they could not read. Some nodded because refusing felt like condemning their child to the street. Some begged to go with them and were told that sacrifice was love. For the children, explanations were thinner. You're going on a trip. You'll see new places. Be good. Listen. Smile. Questions were answered with pats on the head or silence. Children learned early that silence was safer. They learned that adults grew uncomfortable when asked for clarity. So they swallowed questions and packed them where toys should have been. The morning of departure did not feel heroic. It felt confusing. It smelled like coal and damp coats. It sounded like crying that adults pretended not to hear. Lines formed because lines always form when authority tells people where to stand. Names were recorded quickly, often wrong. Accents were misunderstood. Handwriting shook. Ages were guessed because no one had time to verify childhood. Siblings were noted together and then quietly marked for separation if it made placement easier later. No one announced that out loud. Announcements would have required justification. Instead, it was written in margins. Children felt the change before it happened. They always did. A brother squeezed a sister's hand too tightly. A sister promised not to let go. Promises made by children carry a different weight because children believe them. The train itself was ordinary, which made it worse. No ceremony meant no warning. Ordinary trains suggest return trips. They suggest schedules. They suggest that nothing permanent is happening. Inside, seats were hard and windows were too high for smaller bodies. Chaperones counted heads, not hearts. Rules were given quickly. Sit still. Don't wander. Be grateful. Gratitude was demanded before anything had been received. As the train began to move, the city slid away like it was ashamed to be remembered. Some children pressed faces to glass. Some closed their eyes. Some smiled because smiling had kept them safe before. At the first stops, the language changed again. Communities were told to gather, a chance to help, a chance to give a child a home. People came dressed for church, curiosity polished to look like virtue. Children were lined up the way goods are lined up, so comparison feels natural. Inspecting eyes moved quickly. Arms were tested for strength. Teeth were noticed. Quiet children were overlooked. Loud children were judged. Beauty earned pauses. Fragility earned sighs. Siblings learned a new fear, the fear of being chosen separately. When one name was called, relief and terror arrived together. Relief because someone wanted you. Terror because wanting can change. Some families were kind. Kindness existed. It would be dishonest to erase it. But kindness was not the system. Kindness was an accident within it. For many, homes were places where work began before dawn and ended after dark. Where school was optional if labor was needed. Where affection was conditional on obedience. Names were changed because old names carried inconvenient histories. Accents were corrected. Questions were discouraged. Letters were rare and often intercepted. Children learned to survive again, this time inside walls instead of streets. And then there were the ones not chosen. The children left seated while others walked away. The ones who watched hope drain quietly because crying made it worse. They stayed on the train as it moved again. Carrying rejection like luggage no one helped them lift. Each stop repeated the lesson. Worth is decided quickly. Belonging is conditional. Silence is safer than asking why. With every mile, memory thinned. Faces blurred. Cities became stories that sounded less real each time they were told. The people who designed the system slept well. Reports were filed. Numbers looked impressive. Thousands moved. Success measured in distance traveled, not lives fractured. When concerns surfaced, they were softened with phrases like adjustment period and character building. Suffering was reframed as discipline. Loneliness was reframed as independence. Trauma was reframed as growth. Words did the work that conscience refused to do. As the train continued its route, something invisible spread among the children. An understanding that the world had rules they were not allowed to read. That love could be announced and withdrawn without explanation. That survival required learning when to speak and when to disappear. By the time the train slowed at the next town, many had already begun to forget the sound of their own names as they were once spoken with care. And somewhere between the stations, between the promises and the reality, the idea of return quietly died. No one announced it. No bell rang. It simply stopped being mentioned. The train moved forward, and with it moved a new truth the children would carry for the rest of their lives. That mercy can be designed to look like help, and help can still take everything you were. By the time the children reached the holding rooms, they had already learned something important. That waiting could change who you were. Long benches, cold floors, the smell of ink, coal dust, and damp wool. Adults moved quickly because speed makes difficult things feel necessary. Papers were stacked, pens scratched. Names were asked, but listening was optional. A boy said his name carefully, the way his mother used to say it when she was proud. The man wrote something else. It was close enough. Close enough became a habit. Tags were prepared like labels for packages. Thin cardboard, string that scratched the skin. A name sometimes, an age often guessed. A note about health if someone bothered to look. These tags were tied to coats, to collars, to wrists too small to refuse. Children looked down and saw their identities hanging outside their bodies, exposed, simplified, ready to be replaced. Some tried to memorize what was written, afraid that if they forgot, it would become true. Others avoided looking at all because seeing made it permanent. Siblings stood together when they could. Hands found hands. Shoulders leaned against familiar warmth. A girl whispered her brother's name over and over, not because she feared forgetting it, but because she feared the world would. Adults noticed these attachments and wrote small marks in margins. Efficiency does not like complications. Love is a complication. Quiet decisions were made without ceremony. Not now, later, not here, there. No announcements. No explanations. Separation does not need permission when it is written softly. Children were instructed to be presentable. Stand straight. Look grateful. Smile when spoken to. Gratitude again, demanded before anything had been given. Hair was smoothed with hands that did not know them. Dirt was wiped away quickly, as if poverty could be erased with a cloth. No one asked how they had survived this long. Survival stories are inconvenient. They complicate simple narratives of rescue. When the train stopped, doors opened to unfamiliar air. Towns gathered like audiences. Churches opened their basements. Halls filled with murmurs. Children were led out and arranged so they could be seen clearly. This was called introduction. It felt like inspection. Eyes moved the way shoppers' eyes move, quickly, decisively. Strong arms were lifted and flexed. Teeth were checked. Posture mattered. Quiet was mistaken for obedience. Fear was mistaken for politeness. A boy felt a hand squeeze his shoulder and heard a voice say, "This one looks sturdy." Sturdy became his new value. A girl heard someone say, "She's pretty, she'll do well." Pretty became her new promise and her new threat. Another child was passed over because of a limp, because of a cough, because of silence that felt inconvenient. Rejection happened in public, which taught children something lasting. that shame is most effective when shared. When a name on a tag was read aloud, the moment stretched. Relief surged. Terror followed. Chosen meant leaving. Chosen meant not knowing. Chosen meant possibly being loved, possibly being used, possibly both. Siblings listened for their names together. Sometimes they were called one after the other, and hope stayed alive a few seconds longer. Sometimes only one name was spoken. The other child learned to breathe through pain quietly, because noise did not change outcomes. Those not chosen were guided back to the train with practiced hands. Gentle, efficient, detached. The doors closed again. The train moved again. Inside, the children counted losses instead of miles. They learned the geography of absence. Who used to sit there? Who promised to come back? Who waved until the platform disappeared? Each stop took something different. A face, a voice, a shared memory that would now belong to only one person. For those who left the train, homes waited that looked kind from the outside. Porches, fields, clean kitchens. Some doors opened with warmth. Some opened with expectation. First nights were quiet. Quiet can be kind or dangerous. Rules were explained. Work was introduced gently or immediately. Names were shortened, corrected, replaced. Old names sounded foreign in new mouths. Children answered anyway because answering kept peace. Letters were promised. Letters were delayed. Letters were read before being sent, if they were sent at all. Words about missing siblings were softened or removed. Questions were unanswered. Children learned to edit themselves. They learned which memories caused discomfort and which earned praise. Over time, memory adjusted to survive. That is what memory does when it must. Back on the train, the remaining children stared forward. Crying had stopped because crying costs energy. Silence settled in. The train no longer felt like transport. It felt like sorting. With each town, the lesson deepened. You are worth what someone decides in a moment. You belong where you are placed. Your past is flexible. Your future is conditional. Those who organized the process recorded success. Numbers were updated. Smiles were photographed. Reports described happy placements and strong work ethic. No one documented the way children flinched when touched, or how some stopped speaking altogether, or how names faded from use like languages no longer taught. Loss does not fit neatly into tables. As night fell and the train pressed on, children slept sitting up, leaning against strangers who shared the same quiet understanding that whatever they were becoming, it was happening fast, faster than they could stop it. Somewhere between stops, between tags and choices, something inside them hardened slightly, not because they wanted it to, but because softness without safety is dangerous. By the time the next town's lights appeared, many had already learned how to disappear politely, how to wait without hope showing on their faces, how to carry themselves like something that could be accepted or set aside without protest. The train slowed. Doors prepared to open, and the children straightened their backs, because survival had taught them the most important rule of all, that being chosen was not the same as being saved. After the doors closed again, the train carried fewer bodies but more weight. The children felt it even if they could not name it. Each empty seat was a story that would now be told by only one person, if it was told at all. The rhythm of the tracks became familiar, almost comforting because familiarity is something the mind clings to when everything else keeps changing. Outside the windows, towns blurred into shapes without meaning. Inside, the children learned to measure time by stops, not by clocks, by losses, not by distance. At the next town, the same routine unfolded with slight variations, as if repetition could dull its edge. Word had traveled ahead of the train. People gathered early. Curiosity drew some. Need drew others. A few came because it felt like the right thing to do, though they could not explain why. Children were guided off the train and arranged once more. Stand here, face forward. Hands visible, be polite. Politeness was armor now. Smiles were practiced like skills. Those who smiled too much were marked as eager. Those who smiled too little were marked as difficult. Children learned quickly that there was a narrow path between being wanted and being avoided. Questions were asked in voices that sounded gentle. How old are you? Can you read? Have you worked before? Answers were shaped to fit what seemed desirable. Truth bent easily under pressure. A child who had never seen a school said yes anyway. A child who feared animals said he loved farms. Survival required imagination. Adults nodded, satisfied because they heard what they wanted to hear. No one asked what the child wanted. Wanting was considered unnecessary. Selection happened in moments. A nod, a gesture, a name read aloud. The child stepped forward, heart pounding, body light and heavy at the same time. Hands were shaken. Agreements were spoken quickly. Children were placed beside strangers who now had authority over their lives. Some adults crouched to meet their eyes and promised care. Some spoke only to the organizers, as if the child were already an object being transferred. Children listened anyway because listening felt like control. When siblings stood together, the moment grew tense. Adults hesitated. 2 mouths to feed, 2 beds to pass. Decisions were made with forced smiles. Sometimes both were taken, and relief flooded through them like breath after drowning. Sometimes one was chosen, and the other was told to wait. Wait meant return to the line. Wait meant watching someone you love walk away with people you could not follow. Wait meant learning that love does not protect you from being divided. For the child left behind, the world narrowed. Sound dulled. Movement slowed. They watched their sibling disappear into a crowd and tried to memorize the way they walked, the way they turned their head, the way they waved once and then stopped because waving hurt too much. Adults placed a hand on the child's back and guided them away. Not unkindly, just efficiently. Efficiency leaves no room for grief. Back on the train, the remaining children avoided the empty seats at first. Later, they filled them without comment. Loss became normal. They learned not to ask where others had gone, because the answers were never helpful. They learned not to speak names too often, because names echoed when there was no one to answer. Silence thickened. Silence is contagious for those who had left the train. The first days in new homes revealed truths that promises had hidden. Some homes were warm, patient, careful. In those places, children felt confusion more than fear, because kindness can be unfamiliar and therefore unsettling. Other homes were colder. Expectations were clear. Work came early. Mistakes were punished quickly. Gratitude was demanded again, this time with consequences. Children learned to say thank you even when their hands ached, even when their stomachs stayed empty, even when their nights were sleepless. Names continued to change. Old names were shortened because they sounded strange. New names were chosen because they fit better here. Here meant wherever the child now stood. With each name change, a piece of the past loosened its grip. Not because the child wanted to forget, but because remembering made survival harder. Memory learned to wait quietly. Letters, when written, traveled through adult hands first. Words were edited. Complaints disappeared. Praise was encouraged. Children learned to translate their lives into acceptable sentences. I am well. I am grateful. I am learning. Truth lived between the lines, unseen by those who did not want to see it. Meanwhile, the train continued its route, repeating the pattern until it felt endless. At each stop, fewer children remained. Those still aboard grew older inside themselves. They studied adults carefully. They watched how decisions were made. how kindness was performed, how authority moved through rooms. They understood now that being chosen did not guarantee safety, only change. That homes could be places of shelter or places of labor, and sometimes both at once. The organizers spoke of success. Communities congratulated themselves. Photographs were taken of smiling children standing beside new families. Those images traveled far, convincing others that the system worked. No one photographed the children who returned to the train. No one photographed the moment a sibling let go of another sibling's hand. No one photographed the nights when children whispered names into darkness, afraid that silence would erase them completely. As the train moved on once more, the children who remained straightened their clothes and faces. They did this automatically now. They had learned the posture of waiting, the expression of readiness, the quiet discipline of hope held just low enough to avoid breaking. The track stretched ahead, unending, and with every mile, the children understood a little more clearly that this journey was not about finding homes. It was about being sorted, and sorting does not require love, only decisions. Homes were supposed to end the journey, but for many children they were only another beginning, quieter and more permanent. The doors closed behind them, and the world shrank to rules they did not help create. Mornings arrived early. Work arrived earlier. Fields needed tending. Animals needed feeding. Floors needed scrubbing. Hands learned routines before hearts learned safety. Children discovered quickly that usefulness was a form of protection. If you worked well, you were tolerated. If you worked quietly, you were praised. Love, when it appeared, was often tied to performance. Some homes offered warmth that felt almost unreal. Meals were shared. Beds were clean. Voices were gentle. In those places, children struggled with a different fear, the fear that kindness might disappear without warning. They watched faces closely for signs of change. They saved scraps of bread out of habit. They slept lightly, ready to move if needed. Trauma does not dissolve just because conditions improve. It waits, cautious and alert. Other homes were harsher. Expectations were spoken plainly. You are here to help. Education was optional if labor was needed. Mistakes were treated as disobedience. Punishment was framed as character building. Children learned to keep their eyes down and their thoughts private. Crying was discouraged. Complaining was dangerous. Gratitude was demanded daily, as if repeating the word could erase exhaustion. Children said thank you with sore hands and aching backs, because refusing gratitude felt like risking everything. Names continued to change inside these homes. Old names were corrected, shortened, replaced entirely. They sounded foreign in new mouths anyway. New names fit better with the family, with the town, with the idea that the child now belonged here and nowhere else. Belonging came with conditions. Speak this way. Pray this way. Forget that way. Memory became something to manage carefully. Some memories were kept hidden like contraband. Others were allowed to fade because holding them hurt too much. School, when permitted, was another place of adjustment. Children sat beside classmates who had always belonged. Questions about where they came from were common. Answers were practiced. I'm from the city. My parents couldn't care for me. I'm lucky now. Luck became the official explanation, even when it did not feel true. Teachers praised obedience and hard work. Silence was mistaken for discipline. No one asked why a child flinched at raised voices or froze when called upon suddenly. Letters from siblings, when they arrived, were read and reread until the paper thinned. Many never arrived at all. Children learned that distance could swallow people whole. Promises made on platforms faded. Names once spoken daily were spoken less often. Then only at night, then only in thought. The world encouraged forgetting. Forgetting made children easier to keep. In some homes, children were treated as family in public and labor in private. Church pews held smiling faces. Fields held tired bodies. Praise was offered where neighbors could see it. Control lived behind closed doors. Children learned the difference between being displayed and being cared for. They learned which version of themselves was safe to show. There were those who ran away. Running was dangerous, but staying sometimes felt worse. Runaways slept in barns, hid in woods, followed roads without maps. Some were caught and returned. Punishment followed, justified as concern. Some disappeared completely, swallowed by distance and silence. Their names were not searched for. Their absence was noted only briefly, if at all. As years passed, children grew into roles assigned to them: farmhands, helpers, quiet presences in houses that did not fully see them. A few were formally adopted, their pasts officially erased and replaced with paperwork that told a cleaner story. Others remained unofficial, always slightly outside, always aware that belonging could be withdrawn. Papers mattered. Names on documents mattered. Children without them existed in a fragile space, real but unrecognized. The idea of return grew distant. Cities became stories that sounded unreal. Parents' faces blurred. Siblings' voices softened with time. Children felt guilt for forgetting and relief when they did. Both feelings lived together, uncomfortable and inseparable. Survival required adaptation, and adaptation demanded sacrifice. Communities spoke proudly of the children they had taken in. Success stories circulated. Strong workers, good girls, grateful boys. The narrative held, because it needed to. A system survives by telling stories that protect it. The quieter stories, the ones told in whispers or not at all, remained inside the children themselves. At night, when work was done and houses slept, children lay awake and listened to unfamiliar sounds. Wind through unfamiliar trees, floors creaking under unfamiliar roofs. They whispered names into pillows, tested old memories to see if they still fit. Some promised themselves they would remember everything. Some promised themselves they would forget enough to make living easier. And in that quiet, many realized a hard truth. The train had not simply taken them somewhere else. It had placed them in lives that would define them long after the tracks were out of sight. Childhood had not been saved. It had been reshaped, pressed into forms that suited others, leaving the children to figure out who they were supposed to become inside it. Some children did not grow into anything the records could name. They faded quietly, not all at once, but in pieces, until there was nothing left to count. In reports, their absence was described with gentle language. Moved again, placed elsewhere, no longer present. Words designed to soften disappearance. No one liked the word lost. Lost implied responsibility. So the system chose words that closed doors instead of opening questions. Illness took many first. Hard work on young bodies weakened them quickly. Coughs lingered. Fevers returned. Injuries went untreated because time was money, and children were expected to recover on their own. When some died, the notices were brief. A child passed. An accident occurred. A sickness could not be helped. Graves were dug without markers or names that meant anything to anyone else. Families were rarely informed, and when they were, details were thin. Grief was not recorded. Death was processed. Others vanished without death. They ran away and were never found. They were sent to new placements and never heard from again. They were handed off quietly to someone else because they were difficult, disobedient, inconvenient. Paper trails ended abruptly, as if the child had stepped out of the world. No one searched long. Searching would have required admitting failure. Silence was cheaper. Abuse lived in many of these disappearances. hidden behind respectability and distance. Bruises were explained away. Fear was mistaken for stubbornness. Children learned to protect themselves by becoming smaller, quieter, less noticeable. Those who could not adapt were moved again. Movement became punishment. Each move stripped away another layer of identity, another connection, another chance to be remembered accurately. Communities rarely asked what happened to the children who were no longer present. They noticed absence only when work went undone. Replacement came easily. Another child could be found. Another train would arrive. The system did not depend on individuals. It depended on supply. When one disappeared, another filled the space, and the machine continued. The children who remained sensed this truth. They learned that safety was fragile, that making trouble could erase you, that being forgotten was a real and immediate threat. They watched carefully. They noted which behaviors kept them visible in good ways and which made them vanish from conversation. Survival became a careful performance. Years later, some of these children would remember names that no one else remembered. A boy who slept in the next bed, a girl who shared food secretly, a brother sent away for talking back. These memories lived without witnesses. When shared, they were often met with disbelief. If there is no record, people assume it did not happen. Memory alone was not considered evidence. Records themselves were incomplete by design. Documents were lost, altered, or never created. Children's movements were tracked loosely. Birthplaces were listed vaguely. Deaths were underreported. There was no central place where truth gathered. Truth was scattered across towns, offices, and graves that bore no names. To reconstruct a single life required luck, persistence, and a willingness to accept gaps that could never be filled. The children who survived carried the weight of those who did not. Guilt followed them. Why did I stay when others disappeared? Why was I spared? Why was I chosen? These questions had no answers that brought peace. Survival felt arbitrary, not earned. That realization settled deep and shaped how they saw the world. Safety felt temporary. Loss felt inevitable. Those in charge spoke rarely of failures. When pressed, they framed disappearances as unfortunate exceptions. They pointed to success stories. They emphasized numbers served, miles traveled, placements completed. Individual suffering was absorbed into statistics. Numbers do not cry. Numbers do not accuse. At night, in homes and dormitories, in quiet rooms, children lay awake and listened to the sound of distance. They wondered what happened to those who left and never returned. They imagined different endings because imagining was better than not knowing. Some invented gentle conclusions. Some imagined freedom. Some feared the worst and carried that fear quietly so it would not spread. As time passed, the train became a memory, but its consequences did not. The absence of those who vanished left spaces that could not be filled. Their names faded from conversation, then from thought, then from history. What remained was a quiet understanding among those who had been part of it, that survival did not guarantee safety, and that being counted once did not mean you would always be counted again. In the end, the greatest loss was not only the lives that ended too early or the children who vanished without explanation. It was the way their disappearances were made ordinary. When loss becomes routine, it stops alarming those who have the power to stop it. And so the silence returned, heavier than before, carrying with it the weight of all the children who were moved, misplaced, forgotten, and never properly mourned.